Audio unleashed. So what are we talking about this week, man?
Oh, are we starting now?
Well, let's start. Sure, why not?
All right, yeah, we got to get moving here. I got things
rock and roll. It's jazz, man. We're the jazz performers of audio podcasting or something. I don't know. Ignore that.
Okay. All right. Let's play Joy Spring at 200 beats per minute. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
What are we talking about in this week's Audio Unleashed?
True story, by the way. It's happened to me, but I know.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God, did you blow an O-ring?
Actually, I was in the house band for a jam session, and the guitar player quoted Joy Spring in one of his solos, and I was kind of like, oh, he quoted Joy Spring, which is a great Clifford Brown tune, and but the sax player got up. So I was in the house band, so I was playing bass, right, and the sax player got up and called Joy Spring.
Wow!
And the guitar player looks over at me because he'd never played with me before. I'm kind of like, that's all right. And we tore through it. Nice. So that's what we're doing here. This is a highly advanced podcast dealing with fearlessly with in-depth technical topics and making them accessible for people that don't want to read the 2-inch thick books that we read.
Yeah. So what are we starting with?
We're going to start with, this has been kind of brewing with us as we've dealt with people that make claims for products that don't square with the laws of physics and that seem to require a purely subjective review approach to get anyone to endorse them. Plus a lot of marketing.
Yeah.
And so I think the impetus for this was, again, this has been building, but the impetus was a YouTube video that you linked to. And what was the YouTube video? It was some guy.
It was from Passion for Sound, which I think we've talked about them before, but the headline was, shocking Tellurium Q Black 2 power cable review. Yeah, I've got a lot to rant about with this one. But that sort of was the beginning of you building a lot of other sort of tangential topics around that to make a segment. So
we're going to take it, the theme of this is going to be between the Romex and the amp. And the Romex is that white generic wire that's actually inside your walls if you have a relatively new home. New as, 50 years or younger. Yeah. And, there's all kinds of products that people sell that go between the Romex and the amp, from, AC sockets to AC power cords to AC line conditioners and all this stuff. And we're going to talk about whether or not those products can work. And we're going to dig into some discussion of the power supplies in some of these products that you're connecting all these products to, and what those power supplies do and how they work and whether or not all this stuff makes any sense.
Cool.
And then, is it your turn to introduce it? It is.
It is my turn to introduce it, yeah. So then you, sir, have turned me on to a new podcast. I'm ashamed to admit that I have never listened to the occasional podcast before. I didn't know it was a thing, but I'm glad to have discovered it.
5 or 6 years.
Yeah. So the episode in particular that we're talking about is John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity Returns. So DeVore Fidelity. We missed the boat on this a little bit. This podcast episode is from November 2nd of last year, but it's worth talking about because for people who don't know, John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity makes very popular high-end speakers. It's very popular with the high-end audiophile crowd. And in this podcast episode, he does a lot to give what I would consider very common sense, very engineering driven explanations for why he designs his speakers the way he does. And I think it's a very nice sort of counterpoint or alternative to the mentality that we're going to be talking about in the first segment. First segment, we're going to be talking about nonsense. Second segment, we're going to be talking about a lot of sense. I'm excited to dig into this one. And again, thanks for turning me onto this podcast because I really, really dug it.
This was like a masterclass in high-end speaker design to me. It was really great. And so third, we are going to talk about, there's a podcast I listen to called Your Morning Coffee, which is all about, I think it's like your guide to the new music business or something like that. And it's a couple of music industry pros, and they talk a lot about AI and I was shocked that in the latest episode, they actually generated their own theme song for their show using AI with vocals and lyrics and everything.
Yeah.
And they played it, and it's like, it sounds like a top 40 hit.
Yeah.
And, it's this kind of brought me down a little bit of a rabbit hole because, they talk about all this. They go so much in depth and all this stuff. And apparently Tennessee has passed a new law called the Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security Act, otherwise known as the Elvis Act.
Yeah.
That's some shameless but good marketing.
Yeah. No, we call that pandering, sir.
We do call that pandering, yeah, but still, that's good pandering. So anyway, that prohibits the use of AI to mimic an artist's voice. And then there's just recently, like in the last week, there's been this open letter that's gone out from 200 some odd artists, and including people like Billie Eilish and big Stevie Wonder, all kind of people, basically calling for responsible AI practices, which seems to be what the Tennessee law is trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk about what this all means, not only for music, but also for, how does it pertain to audiophiles and high-end audio and low-end audio and mid-end audio.
Yeah.
And everything. And then we're going to have a Patreon segment, right?
We are. And I'm thinking at this point, we probably need to talk John Darko into sponsoring this podcast, because we sure do give him a lot of attention.
We do.
But, hey, he deserves it, man. So this is going to be a video that he did. CD quality Bluetooth is now a reality. But is it worth it? So for people who don't know, AptX Lossless, or AptX in general, is one of the codecs that can be used to make Bluetooth work. So you, in many cases, have to take, a larger data stream and compress it in some way, shape, or form to get it over the limited bandwidth of Bluetooth. So AptX Lossless claims to be not lossy. It's not like MP3. It is true, quote unquote, CD quality wireless Bluetooth transmission. And he reviews the Sennheiser True Wireless Momentum True Wireless 4, I believe that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sort of, talks about what do you get with this, AptX Lossless, and is it worth the trouble? And I think maybe we'll spoil the conclusion, but it'll give us a lot to talk about. So,
there's a lot to talk about. And it just for me personally, having been a former headphone reviewer, and that I only stopped that a year ago, a little more than a year, but, and also being a former employee of a company that makes codecs, Dolby, I am just increasingly incensed by this stuff, but I will share the reasons why I am incensed with our Patreon subscribers.
You know what I'm increasingly incensed about?
What?
People pretending to be skeptical when they are not skeptical.
Gee, Dennis, do you have an example of that you'd like to share with us?
Wow. Well, now that you mention it, I do indeed. It's the aforementioned shocking Tellurium Q Black 2 power cable review from Passion for Sound. Mm-hmm. This irks me, man. This really, really irks me. And the main reason that I wanted to bring this video under the microscope and discuss it is because there are a lot of red flags in the way this is presented. And, a lot of times when you sort of reveal a red flag to someone, they start noticing it in different places. And this isn't necessarily intended as let's deconstruct this specific video and talk about everything that's wrong with it, although we'll do it. But it's like, when someone does this, here's why you should be suspicious. And like one of the first things that he does is this whole, you might think this is silly, but they made a noticeable difference in my system, right? Which is, it's sort of a backhanded, sort of passive-aggressive way of saying, my system is good enough to hear the differences. If you don't hear the differences, that means your system is not good enough. But he's talking about a $900 power cable. And At one point, about 3 minutes into it, I actually it made me so angry, I actually transcribed it. So do you mind if I just read like a few seconds worth of the transcription?
Oh, you transcribed it. Yeah, do.
Yeah. So he says at one point, it annoys me because I don't want to spend any more money and I'm probably not going to. And at that point in time, he's putting up a flashing message on the video going, oh, this isn't going to end well, or famous last words or some crap like that. I mean, he knows what he's doing, right?
Yeah.
But he says, but it's undeniable that it is better sound. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand how the power coming into a device like the Enlium 23R coming through a cable that is at the end of all the other cabling in my house, how that short length of cable can make a difference to the sound is beyond me. And yet it absolutely is. It is making a difference. And it's just like, again, it goes back to exactly what I said. It is faux skepticism. This guy knows all of the reasons why most reasonable people are going to look at this and go, well, this is crap. And he's going to be like, oh, yeah, no, I understand. But you can't deny, you can't deny what I heard. And it's just like, well, yes, I can. At one point he even says like, well, I bet you could hear it in a blind test. It's like, well, if you're so certain about that,
famous last words, yeah.
Why didn't you do a blind test then, right? I mean, It's super easy. Like, I'm jealous of this ABX box that you have. And Erin Hardison, a friend of ours from Erin's Audio Corner, listener of the show, he just bought one too. And I'm kind of jealous. I wish I could do it, but like, it's not hard to do blind. I was just reviewing a Yamaha stereo receiver, and I wanted to compare its reconstruction filters on its DAC to the reconstruction filters in my reference DAC. Yeah, I was able to get my wife to change the inputs with my eyes closed. It was not that hard. If this guy believes it could pass a blind test, he could have gotten somebody to come in and help him with it. And he didn't have to do the fancy ABX comparator. He didn't have to do super rigid scientific stuff. It's not that hard, guys. If you say you think it could pass a blind test, then do the freaking blind test.
Yeah, well, somebody did. Actually, two people did.
Yeah.
And one of them is Cheap Audio Man, who's also a YouTuber.
Yeah.
And did you watch this video?
I did.
Okay. So anyway, his and this guy's got a really good channel. He just covers cheap audio stuff. And he's definitely not someone who feels an obligation to promote high-end audio, which an awful lot of people who write about high-end audio do feel that. So and his conclusion was basically, he tried an Audio Quest power cable versus a generic one and did a blind test. I wasn't super clear how he did it, but he used two different amps, right? And he did an A/B test where he compares A to B and decides if he prefers A or B, right? And which is the way we used to do it at Home Theater Magazine, and a lot of people do that. And he said, it basically wasn't difficult to tell them apart. However, he preferred the generic cable. And then the other test was by veteran audio reviewer Brent Butterworth. And this is recent.
Did you get it done?
It's recent, cool. Yes. So I bought I have an ABX comparator, and I have a couple of Outlaw amps that are matching. And I didn't want to go spend $500 on a power cable, nor did I want to call up somebody and say, hey, lend me your $500 power cable so that I can probably say it doesn't make a difference. So I found a Krell branded power cable, which is kind of weird because I did some tours with Krell, like for dealers, and I when I was the editor of Home Theater Magazine, and I would give a talk about the latest goings on in audio and stuff like that, and then Krell would give a demo. And at the time, Krell's under different ownership now, but at the time, the guy who was what was his title? National Sales Manager at Krell, I think, said, hey, look, you know what? You don't need to use a fancy power cord. We give you a good one. If you want to, you can. That's fine. He also said, don't use power conditioners because it's going to limit the current that goes into the amp. Don't use it. He was like, hey, just use our generic power cord. It's fine. But anyway, this one's Krell branded. And it was a whopping $30 off of, I think off of eBay I got it. And it looks, people charge $500-$600, maybe more, for a cable that looks like this. It has big fat metal connectors. It has, the plugs are actually slightly oversized, so they fit very firmly into the sockets on the amp and the wall. And So I did a blind ABX test, and I couldn't. No big surprise. I could not pass an ABX test on it. It was the results were, the ABX box I have does trials of 8. Right, you do eight things, and that can be whatever you want. You can change the music. You can do anything you want, and you can run them for an hour or two per session, any way you want, right? And so I couldn't tell the difference. I couldn't. It was. I either got 3.5 or 4.4 on it, just so it was a coin flip. Mm-hmm. However, I noticed this. This was a revelation for me. I listened to it, and I'm kind of like, while I was, before I actually did the ABX, I thought, whatever the results are of this, I could see how I could talk myself into the idea that A sounds different from B. And if I go back and forth between A and B, after a while, you can start to go, A clearly sounds better or whatever, or has these differences. Even though in the ABX test, I couldn't identify which was which. Yeah. And so I think almost all the tests that are out there are A/B tests, if they even bother to do blind tests, and there aren't that many of those. But it's like we put a lot of stock in A/B results, even though they're not, anybody can express a preference for A over B.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can take 2 glasses of water that are the same, and one's labeled A and one's labeled B, and you go like, oh, you know what? I like A better.
Yeah.
And it's not, but of course, then you can't tell them apart. But I wanted to, this kind of led me down, we keep going down rabbit holes here, but I got the Audio Advisor catalog, and on the back of it, it had an ad for this Furman power conditioner, right? Mm-hmm. And the headline is almost like doubling the power of your amp. And I'm just like, oh my God. It's like, and it just made me realize that we need to talk about this. We need to talk about how power supplies work, how amps work. And, because let's face it, all this AC stuff, the component that in your audio system that actually draws power is your amp. The rest of them draw a negligible amount of power. You could run them on batteries, really. So, I looked into this power conditioner, and it seems to have some kind of power storage in there, like maybe just a couple big capacitors. They're not that big because this thing is not that big, right? But maybe it's got a couple of capacitors in there that are storing some energy, and supposedly it provides extra output for your, extra AC power for your amp for big peaks, right? And the problem is, if you know anything about amp measurements, if you know anything about power supplies, which you will in another couple minutes, dear listener. If you know anything about power supplies, that's almost certainly not true. Because, well, first of all, the power of, if you look at, good amp measurements anywhere, the guys who measure amps don't use this stuff. And in fact, I found an Audioholics review of this same exact product, and they were, they ran the whole thing through an Audio Precision, and they tried this thing, and they ran it with some amp they don't specify, and they're like, yeah, we couldn't measure anything. But with amp measurements, the things that limit your amp's output are, in almost every case, going to be the power supply of the amp, right? The capacity of your power supply, how much power can that transformer and all that kind of stuff put out, right? And then also the capability of your output devices. How many watts can your output devices put out before they start to overheat and distort, right? You can feed more current into, you can use this thing or one of these other things that claims to feed more current into your amp, but your amp almost certainly cannot do anything with that, right? Yeah. I mean, your wall socket puts out 1,800 watts, right? Just for a 15 amp circuit. And your amp doesn't put out 1,800 watts. Your wall socket, if you take a big amp and you run a measurement on it, of THD versus output, you will start to see the wall socket droop from maybe 118 volts to 115. And it does affect your output. And some people measure with a variac so they can keep a consistent 120 or something. And some people don't. But the difference is going to be pretty small, right? And that's with a big amp that's really sucking tons of power, right? With a normal amp, a normal 100 watt a channel stereo amp, not an issue. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they get into all the filtering. And that's where we got to talk about power supplies. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you strapped in? Are you ready for this?
I am ready. Yes.
Okay. And this is what upsets me is that I learned the basics of power supplies from a Craig Anderson column in Guitar Player magazine when I was about 15 years old. And it wasn't hard for 15-year-old me to grasp. And I read the thing and I'm kind of like, oh, so that's how power supplies work. And then actually like a year later, I took an electronics class in high school and we built a power supply. And
oh, cool.
It's not that hard. So for a normal, most audiophile amps have what's called a linear power supply, which means it's not a switching power supply, and we'll talk about those. A linear power supply is basically you have a transformer that takes your AC voltage and it knocks it down to whatever voltage you decide that you need for your amp, right? And that might be, for a 100 watt amp, that might be 27, 28, 30 volts, something like that. Right. And you go into that, you go into a rectifier and that converts, you've seen the sine wave of AC power, right? And the rectifier, basically a full wave rectifier, takes the negative going sine wave and makes it positive. So you have a whole bunch of positive humps there, right? And that gives you 120 hertz, bzz, right? Hum.
Right.
Then you go into, there's all kind of different ways to do power supplies, but then the most basic way is you go into, there's a big capacitor there, right? And you've seen this in power amps, right? These big things that look like small Coke cans.
Yep.
And basically what that does is instead of those humps, it fills in the gaps between the humps because capacitors store energy, then release it, right? And then you have And now capacitors also filter out high frequency energy. So that capacitor is strapped across the output of the rectifier. Okay. So basically high frequencies go, capacitors pass high frequencies, right?
Yes.
So the high frequencies are shorted out. It's like a short circuit for the high frequencies and the low frequencies can pass, right? So, and the low frequency in this case being DC, which is, 0 hertz. So anyway, so high frequencies die in that big capacitor. And then they also, in almost every decent power supply, the big capacitors actually can leak some high frequency energy because for reasons I don't need to get into, they are not as good at filtering, radio frequency energy. And so they have a little capacitor, like a 1 microfarad ceramic or film capacitor or something strapped across there to catch all the RF, right? Switching power supplies, switch the power off and on real fast, just like a Class D amp at 250 kilohertz or 500 kilohertz or something. And they have a filter at the end to filter all that radio frequency out. Okay. So the idea of all this power stuff, of all these power cables with shielding and crap, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my life. Because the rest of the power system going up to your transformer is not shielded, but somehow putting this little bit of shield on. That's real tinfoil hat stuff, literally and figuratively. And because a tinfoil hat only protects your head, it doesn't protect the rest of your body. And anyway, so all these people talk about all this interference and all this RF that's coming in off of your AC line, but the power supply in your amplifier or your DAC or your whatever already has filtering to get rid of that. Okay? Yeah. And also the level of RF that comes in is measured in milliwatts, right?
Yes.
It's, as we've talked about before, it's insignificant compared to the colossal amount of watts on your AC line. The maybe hundreds of watts coming in on that. It's just trivial. It doesn't matter at all. And there's this whole industry that makes all these products that supposedly filter out all this RF that is supposedly messing up your sound. But there's no, people do amp measurements. It's like your noise floor is 100 dB. That's inaudible. Yeah. Where's all this troublesome noise?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyway, do you have anything to say about power conditioners?
Really quick, because we've run out of time. But I did want to say, our buddy Stephen Stone, who's been on the podcast before, friend of the podcast, was telling me, many years ago he was working for a publication, and he made sort of some dismissive comment about an amplifier not being worth the money or something like that, and they let him go, and they were like, position of our publication is that it's always a good idea to buy more gear. And looping back to the original video that we were talking about, basically the guy admits, like, if you've already spent all of the money you're going to spend on things that do matter, well, you still got to spend money on your system somewhere.
Oh, boy.
So why not here, right? And he's not using those words. I don't even think he's cognizant of the fact that that's what he's saying. But functionally, that's what he's saying. We've got to keep feeding the monster. We've got to keep spending the money on this hobby. And once you've spent money on the stuff that matters, the only thing left is stuff that doesn't. So that's where you got to spend it, you know? And again, he would argue, he would go, no, that's not what I'm saying. And so just to be clear, people should go watch the video and hear it for himself. But that is the way I interpret it. And
well, he's right, but he's wrong at the same time. Because
explain.
If you want to spend more, first of all, these stupid power cables are really, really stiff. Typically.
Yeah.
And they're a real hassle to deal with. Yes. Whereas you could go get cable lifters that also do nothing.
Yeah.
And they look kind of cool. And people would be like, oh man, you're really serious about this stuff, aren't you? And they're effortless to install. They don't make any difference. You know, you can like vacuum under your cables then also. There's a practical aspect to them. Nice. So he's wrong. Cable, if you want to just go blow money on something that does nothing, you need cable lifters for sure.
Oh, that is brilliant. I love it.
Yeah. So you want to move on then?
Yeah, man. Let's go get some water and take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Talk about stuff that actually does matter.
Yeah. Welcome back to Audio
Unleashed.
So, as I said before, in this second segment, we're going to talk about a podcast that you turned me on to, the Occasional Podcast. This is a really, really cool interview with John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity, whom I have to admit, I follow John on social media, and I love the Inktober posts that he makes, and I love looking at the design of his speakers, but I don't have any experience with DeVore Fidelity speakers. I've never actually listened to them. I very much want to. I know you and I have talked about them quite a bit, but I've never heard them. But listening to this podcast really, really makes me want to sit down with a pair of DeVore Fidelity speakers. So thank you for sending this to me.
Yeah, I was drawn to it because on the Occasional Podcast, there's some wackadoodle stuff on there, definitely. But I saw, and actually, I don't know why I got onto this, but I was kind of like looking over what they had, and I saw, they interviewed John DeVore on there, and so John DeVore, I've tested a couple of his speakers. I think I've known him almost since he got started. I think Steve Guttenberg introduced me to him, 20-something years ago.
Oh, cool.
And I've always thought he was a real no BS kind of guy, even though it's a lot of the people that like his speakers are not my favorite reviewers. I'll just put it to you that way. They're more the mystical, magical kind of guys who buy into whatever kind of pitch, right? So I was actually, it was funny. I was at a, before I ever reviewed one of John's speakers, but I knew him for years from seeing it at shows before I got a chance to actually review one of his speakers. And I was sitting at Rocky Mountain Audio Fest, I think, and he was demoing one of his new speakers. And I'm sitting there going I wonder if these are actually any good. And, and he's making the whole sort of mystical, magical pitch, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm yeah. But the guy sitting next to me was John Atkinson from Stereophile.
Yeah.
And John and I are not well acquainted, but I think I went on a junket with him, and I probably had a couple dinners with him. But anyway, John's making this whole mystical, magical pitch. or John DeVore is making this whole mystical, magical pitch, and Atkinson kind of leans over to me and says, "They actually measure good too."
Nice.
Because I knew he was thinking like, he must have been thinking like, oh yeah, this is a little too wackadoodle. But I gotta say, this whole thing, I was so shocked because I was so curious about like, what's John gonna say, and DeVore, and I was shocked. This was great. The host, Brian Hunter, did a great job of peppering John with the right questions. And it is, to me, this is like a masterclass in high-end speaker design. He goes into zero BS. I mean, he goes into all the physics of why he designs his speakers the way he does. And he goes into like, well, these are, compromises that you make. And, the best thing for me is, he starts out saying, he made these kind of skinny speakers because he thought they would be more accepted on the market just for the design and for the look of them, right? Because like no one wants a big fat speaker in their room. Yeah. But he made a big fat speaker just because he liked them. And he's always wanted to make like high efficiency speakers, right? And he goes into the reasons why big fat speakers with a big, huge baffle are more efficient than skinnier speakers, and actually why he thinks they sound better, which is because you have that big fat baffle, right? And
I have to say, like his discussion of the baffle step response compensation, I was just like, I wanted to go pop popcorn and like replay that. It's just like, oh my God, this is so good. This is like one of the best explanations of baffle step response compensation I've ever heard, man. I get it. I actually understand it. This is amazing.
And his whole point was like, okay, well, with the baffle, the big baffle, more of the sound is reflecting off of that baffle and the baffle's reinforcing that, as opposed to with a skinny baffle, more of the sound is wrapping around the speaker, right? And that's determined by the wavelength of sound relative to the width of the baffle, right? And so the wider your baffle is, the lower you can have that baffle step compensation. You can even get it down to where you don't really need much of it and you can just do it with the woofer level, right? So that gives you, more sensitivity because more of the sound is coming off of the baffle, right? If you think about it in terms of like an in-wall speaker, right? Yeah. I mean, all the sound is coming, there's sound going back into the box, right? But there's no sound wrapping around. It's all coming off that wall straight at you. It's what they call a half space, right? And so the big baffle is kind of like a half space. But it's like his explanation was so clear and so completely free of BS. And I loved his discussion of speaker cone materials, because he uses a lot of just like paper woofers, untreated paper cone woofers, which is, that's what I grew up with when I was a kid. My first speakers were stuff that my dad built in around 1958, 60 something, right? Yeah. And John goes into a thing of like, okay, here's a demonstration of what these different materials do. And he says, like, if you think about a pop cam, right, this aluminum, you push on it and, you squeeze it and you get like this click sound, right? Like, right? Yeah. And then if you get a piece of plastic, you get less of that, right? And then if you have something made of paper, like a paper cup, you get almost none of that click sound because it damps the resonance. Yeah. It's like, oh, what a clear explanation. Yeah, he doesn't say, oh, paper is clearly superior and everything else is garbage. And, he's like, well, there are, and he talks a lot about how, they talk about aluminum dome tweeters, which John doesn't use, but he says, well, that's why I don't use them, is because, the tweeters, the silk dome tweeters or whatever are better damped. He's like, but, the guys who make aluminum tweeters have, actually, push their resonance way, way out of the audio band, and they've added some damping, so they have good tweeters too. But I like these, Yeah. It's completely honest. I have a great exchange between me and John that I would like to share.
Ooh, nice.
I reviewed one of his speakers. I guess it was one of the fat ones, which are like the O series or something. I can't go to his website. You can look at his speakers, and
they're so beautiful. So beautiful.
And so I reviewed one of them, and I measured it, and it measured really well. But he has a, the bigger the difference between your woofer / mid-range and your tweeter, the harder it is to get a crossover where you don't have dispersion or distortion problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either the crossover point's too high and you start to get cupped hands distortion like this, or cupped hands coloration off of the woofer because the woofer is directional, or the crossover point's too low and you get distortion in the tweeter. And so he's using a 3/4 inch tweeter, which is unusual. And in that particular speaker, he had a 7-inch woofer. And getting I've seen, it's hard to get a 7-inch woofer to marry with a 1-inch tweeter. But I'm like, why do you use the 3/4 inch tweeter? He's like, I just really like the sound of it. And I said, well, but how do you, it's like, I measure this thing and it measures good. How do you get the 3/4 inch tweeter to mate with the 7-inch woofer? And he pauses for a second. And he's like, well, I work at it.
Nice. Very nice.
So
there was one other aspect to this discussion that I wanted to sort of shine a spotlight on that I thought was really cool that I wish more people would talk about. He was talking about an amplifier in and of itself is not really doing anything. It doesn't do anything until you connect it to a load, right?
Oh, yeah,
and he talks about like the relationship between the speaker and the amplifier and why one amplifier may sound different with one speaker or another type. And it's just, but there's a lot of discussion in our industry about systems matching and the guru types, which we often talk about. And, let's name names here. I'm talking about people like Paul McGowan, right, from PS Audio. They will often say things like, "Oh, if you want advice on this, well, give us a call or ask me specifically, and I will tell you what amp goes with this speaker or what speaker goes with this amp," as if it's just sort of a random dice rolling kind of thing, and they have just stumbled upon the right answer. But DeVore does a really, really great job of explaining, no, this is a function of voltage, and it's Ohm's law, basically, plus sensitivity, and that that will affect what makes this amp speaker combination sound perhaps different than the same amp with a different speaker or the same speaker with a different amp. And I really, really appreciated that part of the conversation. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and he talks a lot. I mean, there's so much, high-end audio, so much of it is gravitated towards using low-powered amps, single-ended triode amps with, big tube amps, with big but low power, with, highly efficient speakers, which is what he makes. And his attitude, he talks about how, when he started out, he wanted to make, basically speakers that were really easy to drive, that any amp could drive. So they don't have these big, giant impedance dips in them, and they're high efficiency. And, and the Brian Hunter, asks him about that. And John doesn't say, oh, well, it's clear that, low power tube amps and high efficiency, that's the way to go. He says, and, so the host says, well, what is the sonic difference between those? And he says, it's not something I'm paraphrasing John, but he's like, it's not something I can confirm or that I have any testing for, but I just think it sounds better. He's like, I feel like the amp is doing less work. There's less heat generated within the speaker and things like that. And I just think it works better, that's fine. There isn't, I would love it if some high-end publication did a serious test of that. It'd be hard because, normally with tests, we try to do all things being equal, and we make it as equal as we can. Like you can test, if you wanted to test a 100-watt per channel solid state amp versus another one, well, that's an easy test because all things are equal. If you want to test a 100-watt per channel solid state amp with a low efficiency speaker versus a 10-watt per channel single-ended triode amp with a high efficiency speaker, well, the speaker's going to sound different.
Yeah,
just
radically.
It'd be a different speaker. It's going to sound different. The amp is going to, the single-ended triode tube amp is going to have a output transformer, right? So it's going to have high output impedance, which will interact with the impedance of your speaker and change the sound substantially.
Yeah.
By a couple decibels. You can see this in John Atkinson's measurements in Stereophile, where he measures with every amp he measures with a load resistor, and also with a simulated speaker load. And you'll see how these single-ended tube amps, well, any of the tube amps that have an output transformer, the sound of the amp, the frequency response of the amp will vary a lot with a simulated speaker load. Whereas
Diego also does that for soundstage measurements.
Okay.
Yeah.
And whereas if you hook up a solid state amp, you'll see very little variance. So but John talks about all that stuff like honestly, and he's informed about it. I really think that everybody who is into this hobby, everybody should go listen to this, because it is just
great.
Normally I would, normally to me, the speaker designer that you want to actually listen to talk about speakers, who is honest and informed. The guy, I think of Andrew Jones, right? And but the thing about Andrew is, even though Andrew does design a colossal range of speakers, he is not catering to the high-end market the way that John does. He doesn't cater as much to audiophiles as John does. And so John sort of explains a lot of these he sort of tackles a lot of these audiophile shibboleths.
Yeah.
But tells you the truth about them and tells you like what's fact, what's not,
Can I read a really, really great quote that I think sums up my attitude toward this discussion and everything you're talking about right now?
Yeah.
This quote comes from one of my absolute favorite two-legged people in the entire world. His name is Brent Butterworth, and he typed this in the idea board for Audio Unleashed. And he said, by not insulting audiophiles' intelligence, he treats audiophiles with far more respect than most of the high-end press does. And I think you absolutely nailed it there. He doesn't treat his potential customers like infants or idiots. He actually respects their intelligence. And that is unfortunately rare, but really great.
Yeah.
So.
I like the quote I have below that even better.
Well, I'm going to let you read that one.
This shows it is possible to have a high-end audio company that's revered even among the whack jobs without resorting to ham-wavy BS or outright fraud.
Oh, man. I think that's a really, really great place to take a break, because we're not going to get any better than that.
I think he'll I don't know if we'll keep that in, but probably a lot of people that would rather we didn't.
Yeah.
All right,
we'll have
take a break.
Then.
Break time.
All right. We'll be right back.
This is Audio
Unleashed.
And we are going to talk about something that shocked me, because, we keep hearing all this stuff about, AI is going to ruin the music business, and, you're going to have, just be able to punch in like, I want to, make an AI version of I want it to be like the Eagles doing a song about my Labrador Retriever, right? And
why would you want that?
Well, the lab part would be lovely, but the Eagles part.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that like the Eagles. So there's no accounting for taste. Anyway, so we've always kind of talked about it in this theoretical standpoint. But Your Morning Coffee, which is a podcast that's done by two old school music industry pros that are, somewhere around my age, but they've, like me, worked at their career for about 30 years or something. And they talk about, what's going on in the music business. They talk about, the latest things going on with Spotify and the latest things going on with AI and all kind of stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so they actually generated a theme song for their show, which they don't have. They have theme music, right? And blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But they generated a theme song for their show. And they played it. And I was just like, oh my God. And this is with vocals. This is with lyrics written. And then, Mike, who's one of the hosts, asked Jay, who had actually done it. He said, well, how long did this take you? And he said, 9 seconds. And it was, it was this thing just instantaneously cranked out something that sounds a lot like Top 40.
Yeah.
And the name of the song was Coffee and Headlines, because it's your morning coffee, and they have, it's music industry news, right?
Right.
But so it's like, I'm sure that Jay did not go in and tweak the prompts and all that kind of stuff. He was just trying to make a point that, like, oh, I went in there in a few seconds, came up with something that is, from a musical standpoint, usable. From a lyrical standpoint, could be usable with a little more work.
Right. And
so this kind of made me think about, what does this mean for audiophiles? What does it mean for, I'm a musician also, and I'm not good enough to where anyone's going to like make an AI version of me. But, what if people can just go, I want a song about that sounds like it's by the Eagles, with Don Henley singing about my dog.
Didn't they specifically say, though, with this particular model that they're using, which what was it called again? Suno, that like you can't specifically say the Eagles, right? I think that one is the one, like, you can't call out an artist by name. You can't say, I want this to sound like Elvis or Todd Rundgren or whatever, right?
But that's right. Yeah, I remember that now. But you could probably say, okay, make it sound like a lame ass 70s country rock band.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
And it would give you, and it would be like, oh, you mean the Eagles.
Oh, you. See, that right there. That's why you're one of my favorite two-legged people in the world. Oh, man. So can I put on my tinfoil hat for a minute?
Go ahead.
Here?
Yeah.
I have expressed conspiracy theories of this sort before when we were talking about journalism. But it seems to me, in this sort of asking, what does all of this mean? I think the music industry has been preparing us for this moment for at least 10 years now, right? And I say that because the way the algorithms have pushed music that is not distinct, doesn't have a lot of human qualities to it. That is the stuff that they've been pushing on us, just the same way that a lot of the publications that we have written for in the past, all of which I've quit, started about 10 years ago, pushing us towards doing the style of article that AI would one day be able to replicate. The sort of very bullet pointy, very listicle kind of thing. One of the main reasons I quit NAPCO back in the day, North American Publishing Company, is because they said, we want you to do more listicles. And I was like, you don't hire me to write listicles, man. It's just like, but a lot of publications want that, and a lot of streaming services are pushing people toward music that is indistinguishable from AI, even before AI could make that music. So I think it is inevitable that we arrived at this point. We were just waiting for the point to where the AI could finally do it convincingly. And that's my conspiracy theory.
So when you say algorithms, you mean the algorithms that Spotify uses to shoot you music after you're done playing your Eagles album, and then it's going to play something else for you.
Right.
Okay. I was going to say, though, that the funny thing about, the tune that they did is it sounds just like most of what's on the top 40. And the fact that, we have an idea, well, what does that sound like? And we start to think of, the Ariana Grande, the Ed Sheeran, the, Taylor Swift. And a lot of those artists, to me, are just unlistenable. It's not like the music sucks. It's that it has no humanity left to it, because they first of all, they comp the vocals. So they do a whole bunch of vocal takes, right? And then they take the best little snippets and phrases out of each one and make one consistent vocal track, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they compress the hell out of the vocals so that, like Beyonce, if you listen to whatever that new tune of hers is, Texas Hold'em, you listen to that, her voice doesn't vary in level. The VU meter on your amp is going to, if it could only listen to her voice, it would just sit there. It would just stand there like you're feeding it a 1K tone at 2 volts, right?
Yeah.
That is not what I want to hear in music.
But again, I think we're saying the same thing in different ways, because I'm saying all of that music that style originated because they're like, one day a computer will be able to do this, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think a computer is necessarily going to come up with I don't know, crosstown traffic or something like that. You know what I mean?
No.
I know I'm reaching in the Wayback Machine for that one, but even like something like, I don't know, think about who's a really, really hot band right now that's not top 40. The Lemon Twigs, right?
Oh yeah, they're one of my favorites.
Crazy about the Lemon Twigs, and
I love them.
Do you?
I've never heard of them.
Oh, okay. So the Lemon Twigs are a couple of young guys. They're, I don't know, maybe late teens, early 20s. I think they're brothers, but they're very, how to describe them? They kind of sound like, you can hear some Todd Rundgren in their stuff. You can hear some Wings in their stuff. And but all of it is filtered through their Gen Z life experience, right? There's no doubt that they love late 60s, early 70s pop rock. And that is the tone and vibe that they're going for. Oh, there's a lot of Beach Boys influence in there too, but it's not, they're not doing this stupid retro recreation thing. They're doing, hey, let's take that sensibility and make it make sense for Gen Z, right? Because that's who we are. And I guess what I'm saying, where I'm going with all of this is all of this AI stuff. Who's it going to inspire 20 years from now? Who's going to be like, yeah, I want to make that, but I want to make it my way, right? I want to make it, because the humanity is lost. So what is there to respond to? What is there to be inspired by? What is there to make somebody else want to go out and bang on a guitar or, Dead Animal Skin or something and just make noise together, right?
Well, that's sort of what Jay and Mike get into in their podcast, is they talk about how apparently the people that are pushing hardest to have like an AI label in the metadata for a tune are the AI companies. Yeah. Because they don't want their models to be learning from other AI, right? Yep. And although there's another thing they talked about a lot in this podcast, and which this really fascinated me, and it was it in this podcast or the next week's podcast? But they talk about AI so much I can't remember. But they talked about how, with art, you have a human being who is trying to inspire or create joy or something with other human beings, to make other human beings feel something. Whereas with AI, the goal is always a transaction. And that's a really important thing to remember, as and they talk about how Spotify and services like that are kind of trying to make it to where you can say, oh, play some lo-fi chill music or something, and it'll just spit out AI created lo-fi chill music, and Spotify doesn't have to pay any royalties on that, right?
I saw a video not long ago where somebody analyzed and basically found the exact same audio track showing up on Spotify like 45 times under different names, like different artist name, different song name. And it's like, nope, it's the same AI generated song over and over and over and over again.
Wow. It's kind of like high-end audio reviews.
Nice. Yeah.
But so did you look at this Elvis Act thing?
I did. Yeah.
And the open letter, from Billie Eilish and Stevie Wonder and many more luminaries.
I did.
Calling for responsible. So what did you think about all that? Do you think that's a futile effort, or do you think there's some chance they would get the tech industry to actually care about this stuff?
I don't know. I mean, I sort of have hope, but it's going to take it's going to take a lot more people than Billie Eilish caring about it. Now, I think I've mentioned this before, but some people know I play tabletop role-playing games. Most people would think, oh, Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, that's the premier tabletop role-playing game. But, about a year ago, the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons, Hasbro, nearly killed it. And they have damaged that brand to the point to where I don't know if they'll ever recover. And one of the things, a lot of it was sort of their end user license agreement thing. But I think one of the things that people reacted to most harshly is they were developing artificial intelligence dungeon masters. So you could just sit at your computer and play with an AI. And also you started to see a lot of companies, I use an AI service called Midjourney to create images for my articles a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And there were people using Midjourney to create artwork that would go into source books for these role-playing games, right? Mm-hmm. As a whole, everybody in this hobby, not everybody, but the vast majority of people in this hobby have said, no, absolutely not. If a book has AI art, I'm not buying it. If a company supports AI dungeon masters, I'm not buying it. And the reason is the whole point of this is to sit around a table with your friends and crack each other up and tell stories and have fun, face-to-face human interaction. So the whole hobby basically just up and decided AI bad, get out, we don't want it, to the point now where if anybody comes into a Reddit group or Facebook group or something like that, and they've got anything AI related, they apologize for, guys, I'm real sorry. I know this is AI. Wow. I know we all hate AI, but and so it can be done. There is a model for how to take a hobby and make people sort of woke to what AI is doing and how it is displacing artists. It's just a matter of, is music enjoyment too big and too diffuse for that sort of organization to happen? I don't know, but I think it's what it's going to take. It's going to take people actively rejecting it. So, I mean, honestly, we've talked in a couple of episodes how like I'm going to be buying a record player, and all of it was really reluctant, and I'm still trying to decide what to buy. And it just seems like too much fuss. But the more I think about it, the more excited I'm getting about it, just because it's, there's this service called Vinyl Moon, which is they basically make mixtapes every month with new indie artists, and they press a piece of vinyl and you subscribe to that. And I'm just like, oh man, that appeals to me, because it's not an algorithm. It's people, tastemakers going, we're selecting this song and we're going to arrange it in this order. And here's our track list and here's the artist. And we're hiring real artists to do artwork, and they'll do 2 different versions of the artwork. And it's just, there's so much passion and humanity involved that it's hooking me. Now, is that going to happen on mass scale? I don't know. I'm not optimistic, but I wish it would. What do you think?
I really think that, look, if you're hoping for something to not result in music in a flood of crappy music, well, I mean, I'm sorry. The last few decades, I think you can argue, certainly the last decade, you can argue that the whole machine is geared towards making crappy music, whether it's the algorithms, or whether it's, oh, gee, I'm a singer, therefore I will get Max Martin to write my songs for me. Okay. Yeah. I mean, Max Martin is an algorithm. He's an algorithm in human form, basically. He does the same thing. He's got a certain set of patterns that he uses to write songs that people will like. And you'd think at some point people will get sick of that, but he's been around for decades and just basically doing the same thing over and over. And I really, look, we're going to have good artists forever, probably, because, people will go to, I'm going to an open mic tonight and performing something, and there'll be people there, and some of them will be kind of, they'll be banging out, meh versions of a Bob Dylan tune or something. But there's going to be somebody there who's writing their own tunes, who's got something, and this is just one open mic in one little town. And, how many more are there going on all around the country tonight? A whole bunch. So there's always going to be that, because that's what humans are driven to do. However, what we listen to on the radio and what Spotify feeds us is, I think, very likely to be a giant pile of garbage.
Yeah. Well, they don't want you to have better alternatives. They want you to have, they want you to be picking between garbage options, right? Because it makes their lives easier. So... yeah, they're the opposite of the audio unleashed podcast. And I can't really explain exactly why, but I was about to say, what the heck does that even mean? I don't know. Anyway, I've got a homework assignment for you.
What's that?
Go listen to the Lemon Twigs, because
I already downloaded their album Go to School.
I really love them, which means you're going to hate them. And there are a few things in this world that I love more than hearing you rant about something that you hate. So this is going to be awesome.
We'll cover that on the next episode of the Audio
Unleashed
podcast. But I think for now we should probably sign off.
So yeah, I'm editing this one. Is it my turn?
You're
forget,
editing this.
Man.
Music will be some combination of us
or something. Yeah. No AI. Absolutely no AI. I'm making that rule, man. Sorry. We don't do mandates around here. We don't do ultimatums. That's ultimatum. No AI music, man. Because you know what? The fun of it is that I'm doing it with you. I mean, I know I'm using keyboards and samples, and I know that kind of turns you off, but we're doing it together, man. And that to me is what music is about. It's like doing something with somebody else and making something that's just, maybe it's not great, but you know what? Screw it. We made it together.
Yeah.
So
exactly. It's the collaboration. Camaraderie,
Yeah. Any other credits we need to get out here? Or?
No, I don't think anybody else helped us this time. We didn't have any guests on.
Yeah.
We didn't have any, we're not using AI, so we don't have to credit any AI companies. There will be no AI in the metadata.
Yeah.
So
let's just tell people to like and subscribe.
Yeah.
And share it with somebody you think you might dig it. So.
Isn't that kind of an AI statement?
You know what? I really hate it when you're right sometimes. Anyway, as always, man, thanks. Everybody that's not a patron, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Patrons, stick around. We got one more coming for you.
Bye, everybody.
Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you liked what you heard and wish there'd been a little bit more of it, we got some good news for you.
Indeed, we do. If you check out patreon.com/Audio Unleashed, all one word, you can get new episodes a little earlier than everybody else.
And sometimes it's like a day or two early. Sometimes it's nearly a week. We never really know until we start editing.
But the big plus is that you get extended cuts of every episode. And usually that's going to mean a whole extra segment that's about maybe a geekier topic or something that's a little more personal to us or something that's just going to really appeal to the hardcore Audio Unleashed listener.
Yeah, what it boils down to is if you're somebody who would support Audio Unleashed on Patreon, we're going to make sure the bonuses to every episode are really aimed straight at your interests.
Yeah, and so if you want to hear these segments, you can subscribe to our Patreon for $3 a month, which is less than I spend every single day on my cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks to write my boring articles.
Yeah. One more time with that URL, that's patreon.com/Audio Unleashed.
Or Audio
Unleashed. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.